Okay, we're going to go to that items. Speaker Wilson is here. We'll go to that, and this is a discussion item. Can we invite Speaker? Come up here, if you would, please. Do you have staff that needs to hang with you, or you're good? Okay, want to welcome Speaker Wilson. Will you hit? There's a. Speaker Wilson wanted to visit with us today about the tax reform. So we'll turn the time over to you. I'm sure we're going to have some questions. We do have a meeting at 11:15. It's our Utah Schools for the Deaf and Blind Board meeting that will start in 1 hour.
I don't have intention of taking an hour, so
okay.
Unless you all want to spend an hour on tax reform.
We could handle a lot of questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions on this, so we're glad you're here.
Yeah, I am glad to be here, and I'm going to ask you a question, Chair Huntsman, in a minute, which is, what do you think the best use of our time is? But let me just start by thanking you for the work that you're all doing. I know that it is tireless and thankless at times, but we've got tremendous respect and admiration for the work of this group and this board, and appreciate all that you do. As we get geared up for the legislative session coming up in January, we'll have a lot of education discussion items that, like we do every year. In fact, it sometimes overwhelms me how many different education discussion items there are, and you're very patient and supportive of that effort, so we appreciate all that you do. And I'd be remiss without thanking Chair Huntsman. We've gotten to know each other well over the last year or two, and really appreciate him and the work that he's done. And he's spent a lot of time with me working on different issues, and also appreciate Sid very much. We just feel so lucky to have her. And I'll just set some context real quick and give you maybe an update as to where we're at with tax reform, and we can talk through our process as well. But you will see a revision to the tax reform bill released sometime today in preparation for Monday's task force meeting. It's intended that Monday's task force meeting will be our last meeting before, hopefully, the governor calls us into special session, potentially next week. And we had good meetings with him yesterday and worked through a couple of logistical items, and you'll see him, I think, weigh in on tax reform sometime over the weekend as well. And we're heading in a good direction. So I don't necessarily, Mark, tell me, what would you like? Would you like me to start at a high level? Do you want me to specifically get into the education funding discussions that Senator Milner and I started back in August? Do you want to talk about tax reform at a broad level? I wasn't given a lot of marching orders, but I've spent so much time on this, I can talk about any or all of it.
You know, I think the education piece might be the best.
Okay.
And I'm not sure how that's been evolving, and do I have a few head nods here that's probably more than the
I assume
big
that's what you
broad.
wanted to talk about. So let me maybe just set a little context first, and then we will get into the education funding component. So you're going to see revenue estimates released fairly soon. And one of the things that's been very apparent to me in my almost 10 years now in the legislature is our income tax revenues and sales tax revenues used to grow at a similar rate, and they continue to diverge. And they're diverging at a higher and higher frequency as well. And so that's creating a lot of problems structurally. You've heard about the structural imbalance that the state is dealing with, which is that sales tax is not keeping up with income tax, and we're within just a couple of years of being unable to fund all the programs in the state that don't get funded with income tax, which is everything other than education, public and higher ed. So legislature needs to act before it's a crisis, and where I think we're just getting in under the wire, to be honest, given how these revenue sources are diverging at a more quick pace. So that's the reason why we're doing this. And the tax reform bill, as outlined, roughly does about a $500 to $600 million structural fix to the state budget. And that is enough that we think it gives us a decade or more of ability to keep funding government programs that we need to fund. So that's the main crux of the bill. All of the shifting from an increase in sales tax revenues, which is what the bill does, and a reduction in income tax revenue is done in higher ed. So public education doesn't see any less revenue in this bill than it has today from income tax. It stays the same. And we just do what we were doing 7, 8 years ago, which is we'll have the majority of higher ed state money funded with sales tax revenue instead of income tax revenue. And it's as simple as that in terms of the structural fix. So that's what the bill does technically to address our structural imbalance, to keep education held harmless. And we will have the ability, like we have the last 4 or 5 years, to then get into the legislative session, know that we've got our funding ducks in a row, and be able to have conversations about investment, new investment in growth in public education, in the weighted pupil unit in public education, and other education funding needs, and not have to worry anymore about the structural imbalance. So that's why it's important for us to get this resolved, and sooner than later. So there were 2 bill files contemplated by the task force related to public education. One was a bill that was to create a new funding model for public education. If we also at the same time passed a bill that put on the ballot the ability for voters to choose whether or not they wanted to remove the constitutional earmark for income tax. And so we've been working on just that. What would an alternative funding model look like for public education that would do a number of things, that would have equity, that would create more stability and predictability, and would give us the opportunity to increase funding for public education over time. And so I'm not familiar with exactly how much conversation this board has had with any of the funding discussion items that Senator Miller and I kind of helped put together. But that is a place we have started, and I can get into the weeds on that if you would like. And let me just do that. So when we go back and look at public education, what has happened historically for public education in terms of the legislature's investment is we make great progress during times of economic expansion. And we fund growth, we fund significant increases in the weighted pupil unit. But because public education is funded by the income tax, our most volatile revenue source, when the economy starts to slow or contract, the revenue source for public education slows and contracts. And so if you go back and look at 2 or 3 economic cycles, and we can get you this data, all the good progress that we make in terms of funding public education and making progress getting more funding per pupil on a real dollar basis stops, and it sometimes gets washed away because the cornerstone of public ed is the income tax, our most volatile revenue source. And so what I believe, and I think what a lot of people believe, is we've got to figure that out, because the only way we're going to, over time, get more funding for public education is if we change the system. And having a system right now that's based on this volatile revenue source isn't probably a winning proposition for public ed, because yeah, we make great progress when times are good, but when the economy's not so good, we lose it all. So how do we, and the challenging thing is when times are not so good and the economy slows down, we still have new kids going to school more than the last year. Inflation doesn't stop. Inflation keeps happening during the times of economic slowdown. But our funding model with public ed based on the income tax doesn't afford us that ability to keep investing in those slow times. So what we need, and this is my terminology, is we need a slow and steady wins the race mentality with public education funding, where when times are good, we're investing money in public ed. But when times are not so good, we can at least pay for the new students that are going into our public schools, and we can at least keep up with inflation. And so if you were to go back and look at about a 20-year funding model for public ed, if all we had done in public education since 1998 is funded growth and inflation with chain CPI and done nothing else, we would have $650 million more in public education than we have today. But what happens is when the economy slows, our system right now doesn't give us the ability to keep up with inflation and keep up with growth. And so we've got to fix that. So the proposal that we've started to talk about addresses that very issue. And it creates a floor, not a minimum, or not a maximum, but it creates a minimum that we could potentially fund public education with. And so, however, at this point, it's very unlikely that will be part of the special session next week. And we just need more time to work with you, to work with other education stakeholders, and try to find the right solution to create more stability and more predictability for public and higher education funding in the state. And it's going to take a lot of creative thinking, and it's going to take us probably maybe thinking outside the box in terms of the way we thought about public education funding historically. I think it's interesting, when we go through the budgeting process right now up at the Capitol, the challenge that we have is that there's a lot of needs across the state. Public education is now the second largest part of the state budget. Social services is the largest. But it's always the first thing we talk about, and it's always the first pot of money that we take off the table. But I think there's even an opportunity for us to do it a little bit different and maybe a little bit better and talk about growth and WPU increases in a different way. But we're going to have to work on that system quite a bit more, and we're going to need your help. So the other challenge we've got with public education is how does the state get more equally, how does the state and the state contribution to public education get closer to the effort at the local level? And we have the local LEA property tax component. There are 3 levies that have served us well, but relative to the state effort, the local effort is low. And so depending on how you look at effort, our data shows that our state effort in terms of state budget is 5th in the country. Our local LEA's effort in terms of property tax is 33rd. And so if there's a way for us to also, in addition to creating more stability and predictability with state revenues, but also find ways for our local districts to get their contribution equal to the state's in terms of effort, we start to make some real progress in terms of public education funding. So at a high level, those are the things we're contemplating. At this point, those are not going to be released in a bill today. This is breaking news. I see a reporter in the room, so I'm sure it'll get tweeted out. The bill that'll be released today will just be on the structural fix, and we will have the conversations about education funding during the general session. So at a high level, that's sort of where we are at, and we'll keep you posted. What kinds of questions do you all have for me?
We have a few, and Angie, it was poor form, but I shot you a text during his remarks, so I apologize for that, but I was listening. Can you just put it up on here? We met as a board and we had a statement that we voted on a message that we wanted to get to our legislators regarding funding, as this was all putting together, and I've just asked Angie to just put it up on.
Well, I'm glad Angie isn't texting during the meetings,
So, but she
even though
was
the
in-
chair
she was
is.
focused, and I
So,
thought,
yeah,
I
she
said,
was
"Hey,
paying attention
get
to
her
what I
ready,"
was
thought.
saying.
So I apologize. Bad form on my part.
We trained her well before you stole her
Okay,
from us. That's why she doesn't text during
Board-
meetings, so.
Board Member Cindy Davis.
Yes, thank you so much for coming today.
my
We
pleasure.
truly appreciate that and know that you have no small task ahead and appreciate your time to communicate with us. As you talk about moving toward additional property taxes, our WPU is our only fully equalized
Correct.
funding mechanism currently. Our property taxes, as we move toward more property tax funding for education, that presents quite a bit of inequity. What have you discussed at the legislative level? What ways to mitigate those inequities are being discussed currently?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And when I started my comments, I said we had a number of principles that we thought were important to consider through this whole process. And the first one I mentioned was equity, because of that very question, right? And if we're going to, and I think it's just right now an interesting question. It's a policy question that this board and the legislature and local districts and local boards and the state in general needs to have a conversation about. But if we want local effort to match state effort, property tax is the vehicle that they choose. So there's a real opportunity there. We've got $1 billion worth of headroom already in property tax, but the equity piece is a challenge. And we already have challenges with equity and property tax, and I think the first thing I would say is we can't make it worse if we go down this path. And how do we even maybe make it better over time because of your concern? I share your concern completely. It's top of mind, and there would need to be, in its simplest form, if we chose to go down this path in one form or another, I think the only way that we would be able to manage it effectively would be to have the state come in with some state money and equalize, like we do in other cases already. So, but great question and a big concern and priority.
What we have up here, it's showing behind you and over here when that's not turned, but there was 4 areas that we really wanted to hopefully retain and maintain, and that's maintain stability in funding for education, increasing strategic investment in education. The third is accounting for variation in school districts' ability to raise local revenue, and the main one is maintain a constitutional guarantee for education funding. And it seems like as you're working through your draft, as you're trying to pull all this together and run your scenarios with your staff and that, and I've seen a kind of a peek of it, but I'm not down into the weeds and into the vetting piece of it. So far, what I've seen of it, I'm very optimistic that you're heading down the road that my board here said these are the 4 really important issues. We just want to keep it simple. And we recognize the fact that you have a very difficult task ahead of you, and I personally applaud you for not kicking the can down the road and just passing that on to future legislators and say, I'm just going to deal with this reality. And our board, in a lot of fashion over the last few years, has been in that mode of let's not kick the can down the road. As issues come before us, we take them on aggressively. We do our very best. We may not always agree on things, but the end result, when we're done, and the evidence will show that that kicking the can down the road is not what we choose to do. And so we definitely recognize the challenge that you have ahead of you, and we need to know what we need to do and what role we need to play in that as that rolls out. We also recognize that you have your lane, we have our lane, and you're welcome at any time to reach out to us and staff, or to get something from our board as you're doing your duty as a legislature. And so thank you for that work. So we have this. I'm not sure if it's all been sent or if it's even been, I don't know if you have access to it, but they're up here for the board's consideration also. But we do have a bunch of questions for you, so we'll get into that because that's what you wanted to hear from board members. So we'll start with Board Member Jenny Earl.
Okay, I'm gonna skip someone, huh? Are you on? Okay, yeah, you are the superintendent. That's why I was like, I see the superintendent before me,
So are we mixed up
so.
here on my, so who wanted to speak?
That's all right, I can go first. I just have a couple of maybe comments, thoughts, that kind of a thing. I would encourage us not to rush this, and I know we've been talking about it for a year, but this is a complete restructuring. And I'm talking not just education, but for our business owners as well. And I think going through the legislative process this next year and allowing those things to be fully vetted in a very open way, and I know we've had public meetings, but I just would hate to rush something and then spend the next 5 years trying to refix kind of what, do you know what I mean, with goods and services. So, and I know that you guys have been very thoughtful. I've talked to a lot of the legislators about this, but I just have a couple of thoughts. One of those is, I know we're trying to maintain that when there is a down year, that we've got the stability, right? I have just one concern with that, and I hope we can just be careful that in maintaining our stability, we aren't creating more concerns for the taxpayers, because those same taxpayers that when there's a down year, it's a down year for them. It's not down year for government if we change things so that we're stable, but they still have a down year. Do you know does that make sense? And so,
I do, yeah.
With that in mind, I just cautious that we're not creating stability for all of our governments, but yet the taxpayers end up with a greater burden. And I'm sure, does that make, because when
It does, and
have-
we've
yeah.
got some thoughts on
So-
how to address that. But
Okay.
let me first of all address your question about process and the.
Oh, I'm just telling Brittany she's next.
You're next, Brittany. So we've had, this Monday will be our 17th public hearing. We've had 55 hours, not of committee hearings, but 55 hours of public comment this year. And most importantly, there's a lot of reasons why we need to get this done before the end of the year. Primarily, we've got, as part of this, we set aside $75 million for a tax cut. And if we delay into the general session, our ability to accomplish that in 2020 probably goes away. And we also set aside we took $332 million of ongoing money last year and flipped it to one-time expenditures that if we don't resolve before the legislative session, we have a lot of programs that are not going to have their ongoing funding base going into next year. The good news is the concern that you kind of alluded to in your question about process was around the business community. And there's not a lot of the business input component that we had in the bill last year. We've only got about $30 million of tax on services as part of the new sales tax base. And it's in very narrow categories like streaming, entertainment services, and Uber and things like that. So we're starting to see, and I think you'll see over the next week, broad support from a lot of different stakeholders, the business community included, in terms of the tax reform proposal that we'll hopefully address next week in a special session. But your question about, I couldn't agree more in terms of we do not want to subordinate the needs of the taxpayers to the needs of government stability. But one of the things we've done that's done the state and public education a big disservice is we've not thought about how do we even out the highs and lows in terms of funding. And so, and this gets really technical really fast, but all I will say is this, and if you want to get into the weeds more, we can. We're very confident with the state money that if we do our budgeting a little bit differently and we stop and we don't invest above trend revenue growth in ongoing programs and we set it aside like we have been doing for the last few years, when the economy slows, we will actually have the ability to continue to fund growth and continue to fund WPU. But what it takes is discipline in the good times. So you don't spend all of the money you have when times are good, so that when times maybe aren't so good, you have some ongoing money you can still lean on and go back to in your working rainy day funds at the state, or your actual rainy day funds, and you can keep your investment in public education going. And we haven't done that historically. This strategy where we pull above trend revenue off and don't invest it in ongoing programs is something that we started about 5 years ago. And so it's one of our budgeting tools that we think, combined with some other changes, would allow us to give a little more stability to public education and maybe a few other vital programs, and not have to, put that on the back of taxpayers in terms of more income taxes or sales taxes during a downturn. The property tax piece is a different component, and it's a big concern. We can't see property taxes going up in times when property values are going down, right? That's a problem for taxpayers. So.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for coming today, as well as addressing this issue. I know from my perspective as a state board member, we see higher ed as that kind of that balancing piece in the budget, and every year we see them kind of coming in heavier and bigger in into the income tax piece, and so it's always kind of been this looming scary thing: is when is it going to get to a point where they're all the way in our bucket and there is no balancing left? And so I appreciate the efforts you guys have made to look at this. And so that leads to my question, and please shake your head if I misunderstood how you explained this earlier. So you're doing this in two phases, rebalancing and then a more comprehensive look at public ed funding. Did I understand that correctly? So in this rebalancing effort, is higher ed still going to be kind of that balancing agent over the two? And then if it takes more time than anticipated to get to that full restructuring idea of how to fund education, do you anticipate higher ed still kind of moving in the direction of the funding, or do you feel like, sorry, this is a long question, do you feel like the increases in the general fund are going to be enough to kind of really keep that at balance for a decent number of years?
So you did understand kind of the two-step approach. We'll fix a structural imbalance in a special session, and we will have a long, hard look at how to stabilize public education funding, in the next general session. That is, at least that's my plan. There's 103 other lawmakers that might have a different plan. But we had conversations with the governor about that approach yesterday as well, and I think he's supportive. So the answer to your second question is it's kind of yes, but it depends. I mean, I think you accurately described the challenge with this. I mean, we hear, and it's sort of, if I can pick on both of the two of you that just asked questions, I mean, we have, a narrative where we got to go slower, we can't move as fast, and then we got to get this done quick because higher ed's going to take all of our money. And so it's sort of this, kind of interesting balancing act we have as lawmakers of how do we do what's best overall for the state. And I think we're striking the right balance, but it's hard to predict where state revenues are going to go and where income tax revenue is going to go over the next few years, right? But I will say that I think it's in all of our best interest to keep and stay vigilant about how do we keep our tax code current and how do we keep our tax system relevant for the economy we're in. And we're making a small step in terms of moving our tax code to the new economy, but there's probably more work to be done. And I think at the end of the day, that will help the economy because you want to have a healthy economy and a good tax code for not just revenue for government programs, but you more importantly need a good tax code that's fair for residents and is also good for people that want to create jobs so people have jobs, and try to balance all those things together. But I think if we don't do anything, yeah, you will see higher ed take more and more of the education fund over time unless we can't keep working on this.
Yeah, follow up.
So in your conversation earlier, you talked about the income tax as being one of the most volatile sources of revenue.
It's our most volatile source, yeah.
So as you look forward kind of to this potential relook at funding education, are you looking for a more stable revenue source, or are you looking at just creating a more larger pot of different sources of revenue?
I think
What's
everything
the-
will be on the table.
Everything on the
Yeah,
table?
we could use your good ideas.
Okay.
So it is, you know, 1948, I think, is when the constitutional earmark was put in place, and well-intentioned, right? I mean, it sends the right message. It's a source of revenue, but it is, I think if you could go back and say, is that the ideal way to fund public education? Well, no, it's not. Absolutely is not. It's the most volatile. We can dedicate 100% of the income tax to public education, but what does that mean? And what is the rate? And what exemptions are you taking out of it? Who's paying it? And how volatile is it? And you know, a principle of budgeting is you don't want to take your ongoing, in particular, personnel expenses, and we've tied our most expensive ongoing government program, which is public education, and tied it to our most volatile revenue source. I mean, I just don't think that probably serves us well, but it's what we've got, right? And so we just have to make the best of it, so.
Thank you.
Board Member Lear?
Thank you. I appreciate you coming. It's not easy to come to a public body that doesn't always share exactly your opinions, so I really appreciate the public conversation.
I think we all actually want the same thing, right? So
Probably,
yeah,
just maybe
yeah.
in different ways.
Yeah, that's right.
I had two unrelated questions, Chair. Well,
Okay.
one's a comment and one's a question. You said earlier something that surprised me that is different than information I've heard. You said that the state was 5th in tax effort toward education, and I was curious about your source, because everything I've read in the last several years from the Utah Foundation says that we're about 37th or 38th, down from about 8th, maybe 12 years
So I'm talking
ago.
about percent of state budget.
Percent
And
of state budget, maybe a little different than effort, maybe a less complicated than effort.
well, I'm not a professional educator, but when we look at, and I can get you the source, Carol.
I'm not a mathematician,
So,
so-
yeah, we'll get you that information. But when we compare our state's effort in terms of overall budget to other states, we're 5th in the country.
Right, looking at, yes, I would agree with, I can believe that. I thought that the Utah Foundation had other factors in it.
They
that-
may
that
they may
spelled out-
describe it differently.
That spelled out effort,
So,
which has
yeah.
always been sort of disappointing to me that we've gone down so far,
Sure.
again, according to the Utah Foundation. My second concern I just wanted to express was that we've heard talk about sales tax being substituted or raised or increased, not necessarily to fund, I don't know if it's directly to fund education, but just as one educator and a person who represents Salt Lake District as well as all the children of the state, I would really, I don't like the idea of raising sales tax even to fund education, because that doesn't really help us. It means hungrier kids come to school. It means that families are more stressed out, creating mental health issues that then come to school.
You're talking about the sales tax on food, is that what
Sales
you're
tax
talking
on-
about?
On
Okay,
food primarily,
okay, okay.
yes. I have mixed feelings, lawyer, educator in me, about sales tax on services, but sales tax on food is not something that I personally support, and that troubles me if that's our alternative funding anything, because it ends up hurting schools, I feel like, even if the overall state revenue increases.
Let me just address that last piece real
Sure.
quick. So right now, in 2006, 2007, when the sales tax on food was reduced from the full rate to 1.7%, that created a benefit to the bottom 3 deciles, which are the constituents you're talking about. It's a benefit of about $30 million. Okay, that's how much they save across the whole state in not paying sales tax on food, the full rate. So what the bill does is it does restore the full sales tax rate on food, but it takes and puts about just shy of $70 million worth of credits into that exact same population. So we more than double the benefit to them in a food credit. So it will, and it's a refundable food credit. So they don't have to have income tax that they're paying to offset that credit. They can pay no income tax and still get that credit of $125 per person. And in addition to that, this bill also restores almost the full child care exemptions, dependent exemptions that were lost a few years ago in some federal reform. And so as a percentage of household income, this tax reform proposal that's going to be discussed on Monday, the biggest percentage in terms of household income winners are those under about $60,000 a year in household income. And so I would admit that the one thing it does create is an interesting timing question. So there's going to be 2 to 3 times the dollar benefit for those bottom 3 or 4 deciles in terms of income levels, but they get it towards the end. And so I had a conversation on the drive here actually with some folks from the business community that are, this could be a really interesting opportunity for the state to find some public and private partnerships to help address that issue. And so there's also some proposals, one that I think we'll see during the general session, which deals with this issue head on and may give us an opportunity to help. But I think that at the end of the day, the reason you're seeing some of the advocacy groups start to come out in favor of the proposal is they realize, in addition to the food credit, and in addition to the earned income tax credit, which we're giving low-income individuals, there's some other programs that are going to help them in kind of a significant way. But I do understand your concern, and we've, I think, done quite a bit to address it.
Short follow-up, Chair, just
Yes,
one
follow-up.
comment. I appreciate the tax credit, the credit, food credit approach. I'm just concerned in that population are the least likely to be able to have the sophistication to claim those credits.
Yep, so we're actually going to be putting some resources into helping them go out and claim it.
And that's, again, feels better.
Yep.
But I'll have that concern about back-end credits. And also, there are also families that usually have cash flow problems. So being able to get it 6
Yep.
months later doesn't necessarily help them with the family budget.
So that's some of the things we're going to keep working on.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we're starting to run close to time, so we've got 3 other comments or questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. So remember, we have this other meeting we've got to set up for it, and we got about 3 to 4 minutes of a wrap-up. So Board Member Janet Cannon.
Thank you. I have a comment and then a question. Comment first. As a Utahn, I feel very proud of our state legislature and the way they have run things financially and how solvent Utah has been even in times of crisis with the finances. I'm very proud of that. As a state board member, I'm not very proud that for the past 30 years, Utah has been the most poorly funded education system in terms of per pupil expenditure. So I have those 2 balancing comments. And I'd like you to address the idea we've put up here, we'd like to see some kind of constitutional guarantee for education funding, because the proposal of eliminating or having the ballot issue to remove that funding from students who are the most poorly per pupil funded in the United States sounds very scary and threatening to me. So I'm looking for some assurance from our financially capable state.
Yeah, so I've heard that question a lot, and I've actually said for a long time, first of all, and I don't want to be controversial or say things that upset people, but the earmark that everyone is so worried about protecting has taken us from 50th to 50th in per pupil funding. Let's just be honest. If that is what we think is ever going to solve our education funding challenges, and because I agree with you, like, it is not a badge of honor, right? But the earmark has not been a vehicle that has gotten us to where you want to go. And it's because it's not a funding system. It is not designed to provide stability. It is not designed to ensure we fund growth in the public education enrollment. It's not a funding system. It feels good, but it doesn't give us any kind of funding certainty. And so what we need to have a conversation about is, what could we take in this constitutional earmark that we have now and replace it with something that actually does give us some certainty and does give us a funding system? And that's the challenge, I think, in front of us. Because, hey, I don't blame people for not wanting to get rid of the earmark, because we don't have anything to replace it with, right? And we want to have something that will tell us we're going to fund public education, educate our kids, take care of the next generation. I am 100% in agreement with you. I'm just saying we have to at some point have an honest conversation. The earmark has not worked. So
do you have the answer?
well, I think that the ideas we've talked about we have some ideas and we're working through them, but it's going to take everyone, I think, to think outside the box a little bit and work on this. So we'll keep working on it. But yeah, we've got ideas. So. Well, I kind of talked about them at a high level when we started, so, but we can get into the weeds at some point if you'd like, so.
Board Member Cindy Davis, this will be our concluding comments.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One, is there anything currently in code that precludes the legislature from going beyond the income tax or the earmark in times of difficulty right now? And then the second question is,
No, we do. We put general fund in public education every year.
okay, so the earmark isn't necessarily responsible for keeping us at the bottom, sounds like what I'm hearing.
No, I didn't say that it was.
Okay, okay. I just wanted to
I'm
clarify to
saying
see if there
everyone's
was
so worried
code.
about protecting the earmark because they think it's working so well, and I'm just saying it hasn't worked very well.
Right, used in isolation. Yeah, agreed. And then the other question is, I have heard folks say it's difficult to weigh in on tax restructuring proposals with the education funding discussion being held separately. And it sounds like there is some time constraints where you have to do one and then are trying to do the other in a general session. But will there be time at least when in the special session for our legislators to at least include some type of a statement, not just to hold harmless education, but maybe some type of a statement that there will be efforts to improve, just because having been in
Yep,
so many
yep.
schools, learning conditions are not ideal, and it would be great if we could make some improvements. Our great success that we see publicly and comparatively nationally, I believe, truly falls on the backs of our good educators and families right now, and I think we could do a little more to support.
Were you at my family Christmas party last week? And I got attacked by two of my sisters that are educators.
No, and I hope that
so-
wasn't seen in any way as an attack. I certainly feel the weight of
they
what you
attacked
have
me.
to
You were
do.
very nice. So, but I totally agree. I mean, the challenge is we will do the general sessions when we do all the appropriation. But I think you'll see a statement from my office today. There's going to be some information coming out later today, and I think you'll see a statement from other state leaders about our commitment to public education funding and continuing. We've put a significant amount of new resources into public education over the last 5 or 6 years, and economy willing, I hope we're able to keep doing that. So.
Speaker, thank you for your time. We talked about the badge of honor we wear on our ranking, and I'm going to invite Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman to come up and just share just one little piece of this badge of honor that we wear. And as I go to the other states and adjacent states to this one, and with my work, we always seem to get into I don't know why it follows, and maybe education chases me down, and we talk education, see, what are you doing? But they know that I'm just a little bit involved in our public education system. But the badge of honor that I wear is that in this great state of Utah, we make education happen. And when you look at numbers and this, and everything that's there, there's some numbers we definitely can improve on. And then we as a board and as a state, we know that we haven't arrived. We've got a lot of work to do, but we have upward momentum. And I've asked Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman to just share some stats. I call them some first, and then if you can keep some of these in mind as you're talking with your fellow legislators on what right looks like and you're proposing these betterments, we are on a road to awesome. We say that, but that we haven't hit that destination. And if you can, well, I'll have Patty read some of these, and she can certainly get to them. But now and again, we spend so much time talking about the work that we've got to do and the things that we've got to improve. And Patty was part of a portrait of a graduate. In fact, she went to China and kind of put Utah on the map on some really good things that we've got going on. And we don't have time to get into that, her quick 3 days there work and then get back here because she has work here and get ready for a board meeting. She didn't even have time to play or eat, I think. I can't remember all of that. But will you share those with us?
Yeah, Patty Norman, Deputy Superintendent of Student Achievement. And these stats were gathered through a collaborative effort. There were many people who contributed to this so that when we went to China, we could show what really Utah was doing, and Utah was there to represent the nation and in education and innovation. And then also the United States was selected to represent one of 7 countries in the world with educational innovation. So it was selected with countries such as Finland, Japan, China, all of those that are ranking the highest with educational innovation and on educational scores throughout the nation. So here are some of the stats that we have that I think are really a collaborative effort of all of those agencies and the outcomes in education. 91.8% of people over age 25 have a high school diploma. In Utah, 32.5% of Utahns have at least a bachelor's degree. So 1/3 of our population has at least a bachelor's degree. 93.5 have a home computer, and 83.7 have broadband internet. And that makes us very marketable to those entities that are coming in saying that you have the most educated people for us to access. So we are last in funding, as this conversation has been about, but we have the highest achievement in 8th grade NAEP, and we are above average on all other NAEP measures. We are higher than the nation on AP exam pass rates. We're the number 1 best fiscally stable state, according to the U.S. News, number 1 state for entrepreneurs, according to Amazon. We are the number 1 in the narrowest wealth gap. So we have the gap between the highest and the lowest socioeconomics. We are the number 1 state with the narrowest gap. That's according to Newsweek. We are the number 1 fastest in broadband speeds in the western U.S. We have the number 1 state for upward mobility, meaning you can come to the state of Utah having absolutely nothing, and you can achieve according to those things that you set out for yourself. We're the number 1 in economic outlook since 2008. We're the number 1 most diverse state economically. We are the number 1 state in population growth for the entire nation. Now we are the number 2 best state for business, according to Forbes, but of course we can be number 1 at any time with these efforts that are being put forth. We're the number 3 state in educational rankings, but number 1 and 2 are Massachusetts and New Jersey. We also, our education's role, we have one key factor, and that's the availability of capable employees. And Utah's top-tier education system that exposes all students to academics in all areas. We don't, through 8th grade, we don't track students out. We educate all students through 12th grade, and most that are scoring highest or that have higher achieving across the world are those that track students out at 9th grade. And this is the collaborative responsibility. We have UETN that helped make that possible with the broadband internet. We have the standards that are put forth before the board that actually say what are the academic things that students should know and be able to do to make those things happen. We have our higher education partners as well, and the portrait of a graduate that we can talk to you about at a later time. But the portrait of a graduate with these outcomes are what made the world take notice and put Utah on the map.
Thank you, Patty. So, Speaker, thank you for being here. And with these numbers and that, we we don't want to slip. We want to keep improving. And we recognize the good work that you guys do. We've got another session coming up. We're looking forward to working together to continue these kind of numbers and also bring more and more betterments so we can have this great state of Utah. Now, we recognize that we don't have a direct role in the success of these businesses, but a lot of these businesses, their education is coming from here in Utah, so we feel like we can pat ourselves on the back a little bit. And so we want to share that badge with the legislature that in your capacity, that you're also making great education happen. So we throw that invitation back or out to you as you're doing your tax reform and as you're rethinking how public education will be funded. Reach out to us at any time. We're glad to come to the table and participate. And you're welcome back here also to update my board. So
Thanks,
thank you
Mark.
for your time. I'll leave the closing remarks to you, and then.
Well, I'll just make a couple comments. We've talked a lot about a lot of different things, but the challenge the legislature has in front of it over the next week or two is to do something that I think should matter tremendously to this group, which is we have to fix the structural imbalance of the state. You talked about the fact that we've got higher ed using income tax money, but the truth is we're within 2 to 3 years of the state not being able to fund social service programs, not to be able to fund some of our corrections needs, criminal justice issues, take care of our natural resources because of how far out of whack our revenue streams are. You're going to see some numbers later today that I think will be shocking in terms of the general fund's growth relative to the education funds. And it underscores the importance of getting our structural imbalance fixed. Because if we don't, we're not going to be able to do the kinds of things that surround our kids. There's a lot of money that we put into programs that support kids in low-income areas, in middle-income areas, and those programs are in jeopardy. We have to fix the structural imbalance. We're doing it in a way that doesn't hurt public education funding, and then we will get to work in trying to find some new and innovative ways to create more stability for public education funding in the future. And so I appreciate your work. I have 2 kids in public school right now. My son's at Farmington High, and he's a good student, a lot better student than I was. He just took, without studying, he just took his ACT. I'm going to brag on him a little bit. He just took his ACT practice test and scored really, really well. Not a 36, which is what I told him he needed, but into his 30s. And the truth is, it's because he goes to a great school, and he's gone to great schools. And we're very blessed to have the educators we have in the state and public servants like you helping to guide our public education system. There's nothing that's more important that we do, but we have other things we have to do too. So we're trying to do it all at the same time. So thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. This is our last agenda item, so this concludes this meeting. This meeting's adjourned. We will be meeting here. Let's do a quick break. We'll get set up. As soon as we can get back in here, we'll be starting our Utah Schools for the Deaf and Blind Board meeting. So thank you.